All right. Well, first of all, can everybody hear me? Okay. Good afternoon. I'm Stephen Piper. I'm an affiliate here with the Center for International Security and Cooperation, and I will be introducing and moderating today's panel discussion. We're going to look at Ukraine and the future of European security. And how we're going to proceed is after introductions, we'll do two rounds. I'll take questions to the panelists. We'll talk about the threat and its perception. And then in the second round, we'll talk about what do we do about it. So first, let me briefly introduce our three panelists. Our first panelist is Gabrielius Landsbergis. He is the Bernard and Susan Detand, visiting fellow at Sweden Scoville Institute. But importantly for our discussion today, he's a former foreign minister of Lithuania. Prior to that, he was a member of parliament, and he was the leader of the Homeland Union Party. And before that, he was a member of the European Parliament. Our second speaker is Rose Gottemoeller. She is a William J. Perry lecturer here at the FSI. She's also a research fellow at the Hoover Institution, and she held a number of government positions. Actually, her last position before coming to Stanford was Deputy Secretary General of NATO. Before that, at the State Department, she was first Assistant Secretary of State for Arms Control, Verification, and Compliance. In that position, she was the lead U.S. negotiator for the New START Treaty, and then she was Undersecretary of State for International Security and Arms Control. And our last speaker will be Colin Kahl. He is a Stephen C. Hazy Fellow here at CSAC, and also a professor of political science at the university. He's held a number of government positions. In the Obama administration, he was the National Security Advisor to then Vice President Biden, and he was the Deputy National Security Advisor to President Obama. And in the Biden administration, he was the Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Policy. That's the third ranking position at the Pentagon. So with that introduction, we're looking and talking at a time when Europe is going through quite a bit of turmoil. A cooperative security architecture, which began to be built back in 1975 with the Helsinki Final Act, and then was added to with a number of other arrangements, arms control agreements, confidence and security building measures. That whole regime really has been shattered. We now have a Russia-Ukraine war, which actually began in 2014 when Russia seized the Crimean Peninsula, and then entered a new stage in 2022 with the Russian invasion that made that war the largest and bloodiest war that Europe has seen since 1945. And I think at this point, one has to expect that that war is going to continue for some time to come. The Trump administration has made some effort, but I don't think they've mobilized the full leverage that they have. And therefore, at this point, I'm not sure that that effort is going to succeed in trying to broker some kind of at least a ceasefire between Russia and Ukraine. And you have a situation now where I think that Europeans now increasingly now come to regard Russia as a major threat to their security. And it was encapsulated really at the NATO summit this summer, where NATO countries, I believe with the exception of one, signed on to a commitment to commit 5% of their gross domestic product to either defense. Hard defense would be 3.5%, and an additional 1.5% for things such as making cyber networks more resilient and such. So that's where the situation is now. And again, I'm going to start off by talking a little bit about the threat. So, Alice, I want to start with you. I mean, Lithuania, you don't border Russia proper, but you're between Belarus, a Russian ally, and the Russian exclave of Kaliningrad. So can you talk a little bit about how Lithuania and the Baltic states view the threat that Russia poses to security, well, to Ukraine, but also the Baltic states, and then more broadly towards Europe?
Thank you so much for this opportunity. So I probably should start going a bit backwards from the 1990s, because if there's one thing that we in the Baltic region proud ourselves is consistency. So after gaining independence, there were politicians well, I will speak about my country, who were very clear that Russia's threat is not going away. Despite the fall of Berlin Wall, despite of all the treaties that have been reviewed, resigned, and so much, and the trust that has been starting to be rebuilt between the West and the Soviet Union and its going forward, Russia, the belief in the Baltic states was always that Russia is an imperialist power that has not accepted the defeat in Cold War and has not ceded its ambition to recover what it believes it has lost. Going forward, all the evidence, first of all, the first Chechen War, 1994, the second Chechen War, 1999, proved to most people in the Baltics that we are right. We've been right. And you would see us repeating exactly the same argument going forward. 2008, like against Georgia, Vilnius is full of Georgian flags. Lithuanian politicians saying, "Look, this is the Russia that we know. This is the same country that has occupied us in the 1940s. Unfortunately, it has not reformed, and it has not yet accepted that the world is different." 2014, the tensions go higher. Crimea is occupied. The Balts feel under pressure. In Lithuania, this is the first time when we return the conscription. We mobilize the population. We start ramping up our defense spending, soon reaching to 2% of GDP. Well, 2022, that was a moment where there was a reason for quite a lot of politicians, analysts in the Baltic states say, "We were told you so." But there was another part that people would accept that, well, you told us so. Now, the only question that remains to be answered, because we are still telling certain things, but not necessarily everybody's willing to accept about where the current situation is taking us further. I would like, so I know that I don't have too much time now, but the main point here is that we're definitely not out of the woods yet. The darkest, and we expect the night darkest before the dawn, so I don't think that we've seen the darkest of it. There are several possible outcomes, and I called the current situation in 2023. I, still as a Minister of Foreign Affairs, I came out saying that we might approach a situation of a perfect geopolitical storm in Europe, where undeterred Putin, we're unable to stop him. He continues in the battlefield, paying enormously high price, but he will continue to threaten Ukraine and at least those countries who are closest to him geographically. And if Donald Trump is re-elected as a president and he makes good on his promise, then the promise was to leave NATO altogether. But even if he doesn't leave NATO, but he changes his position, attitude, posturing of the United States in Europe, we might be in the most dangerous of situations after Second World War. Situation could be worse now, but it's definitely not good. Ukraine has been able to slow down Russians considerably, has been able to build up a leverage against Russia with its long-range strikes and its own equipment that it's been building up. But unfortunately, Russians are able to continue pressing on. The latest announcements about Pokrovsk town, which is a major transport hub for Ukrainian defense effort, tells us exactly that Russians are ready to pay enormously high price and are able to continue with their war effort. Where they are unable to continue in Ukraine, they are expanding their escalation horizontally, meaning dragging in more countries in Europe and NATO into the territories that they are not afraid to escalate. This is called a hybrid war. I don't entirely like the phrase itself. I believe that it hides a little bit of, leaves the ambiguity about the answer, because if we're unable to say what it is it terrorism, is it an attack, is it an act of war, that doesn't require us to respond properly into those acts. That, again, my strong belief is allows Russia to escalate. And we've been seeing exactly that. It started with arson attempts and cable cuttings, attempted assassinations. Now we have drones in NATO territory, jets flying in the territory of NATO countries, and that is an absolutely new development. I think that one is we are being tested about our response. United States is being tested about their how resolute is United States to defending and deterring Russia from entering anyway or threatening European countries. but also they would like to decouple Europe or Western countries from assisting Ukraine, sending a message that maybe Europe needs to take care more about its own defense, spend on its own defense more rather than spending on Ukraine. And here we actually might appear at a critical juncture. This year, Europe managed to pay up for what has not been paid by assist Ukraine, cover the loss of United States assistance to Ukraine. That means that the assistance in 2024 has been matched in 2025, but now going forward, there's no clear answer whether that would be achieved in 2026. There are no new plans being drafted. I think that it could be due to the fact that the countries were expecting maybe a ceasefire to be signed, and maybe the levels of support that is needed to Ukraine should be dropping. That didn't happen. No plans are in place. Europe is really caught in a spending spree to ramp up our defense, and unfortunately, Ukraine is not yet in the strongest position. That's why, going forward, most likely we will continue to see further Russian advances in Ukraine. I would not exclude that further escalation in European countries, which might, if it continues to be linear, we might appear in a rather dangerous situation in Europe. Sorry for a long introduction.
Thanks. Rose, if we go back to, say, 2010, when you were at the State Department, at that point, I think you would have described the NATO-Russia relationship still as pretty cooperative. So there was even an effort, for example, then President Medvedev attended the NATO summit in 2010. There was an effort to negotiate or work out the arrangements for a cooperative missile defense. Lots changed. So can you talk a little bit about how NATO's view of Russia has evolved over the last 15 years, particularly during your watch, and how NATO now looks for Russian threat?
Right, yes, and 2010 seems like an eon ago, but it was a much different moment in our bilateral U.S.-Russian relationship. We had just completed at that point negotiation of the New START Treaty. It had been signed by then President Medvedev as well as President Obama in April of 2010. It was in the ratification process in the United States. And all in all, there was this reset effort still ongoing that President Obama had launched quite early in his first term in office in 2009. And it was getting scratchy because it was clear that Medvedev was not exactly firmly in his seat as Russian president at that point. And indeed, within a year, President Putin had shoved him aside and moved back into the presidency. And Medvedev, again, they called it the Rokirovka. They just switched roles, and went back to prime minister for the time being and didn't last in that role. But the point was, at that moment, there was still a good deal of cooperation going on, not only between Russia and the United States, but also between Russia and NATO. At the time of the Rome summit in 2002, Russia, Vladimir Putin, believe it or not, had signed something called the Rome Declaration, which launched almost a decade and a half of cooperation between NATO and Russia. So at that time, even Vladimir Putin seemed to be somewhat acquiescing to close cooperation between NATO and Russia, but it was getting scratchier in the 2010-2011 timeframe, and the tensions continued to rise so that we saw the first Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2014. Now, that was a wake-up call to the NATO alliance, and at that point, they agreed to spend 2% of their gross domestic product on defense. But it wasn't a complete wake-up call because they continued in a kind of passive stance of being able to free ride on the United States and let the United States continue to pay for the vast majority of the defense capability and capacity in Europe, deployed in Europe. At that time, when I arrived at NATO in 2016, there were only 3 countries who had stepped up to the 2% of GDP requirement that had been agreed at the Wales summit in 2014. Those countries were the United States, the UK, and Greece, who has a very large defense budget because they put all the pensions for their retirees under the defense budget. So they may not have a lot of boots on the ground, they may not have a lot of equipment, but they've got a big defense budget because of that. So fast forward to President Trump's first arrival at NATO headquarters in May of 2017, and we thought, we could we could work with this man. He was surrounded by people like Jim Mattis and General McMaster. So there were, signs coming to us from Washington that we could work with this man. Trump was furious. And it was that first occasion, that first summit in May of 2017, when he said to the allies, pay up. And if you don't pay up, I'm not going to fulfill the Article 5 commitment under the Washington Treaty to defend a NATO ally if it is attacked, or I may even leave NATO. So this was an enormous shock to the allies at the time. And I have to say that the Secretary General of NATO at the time, Jens Stoltenberg, used that pressure from Washington very effectively to basically wake the allies out of their passivity. And I think that was an important accomplishment of Trump's first term in office, that he, with his very strong, strident demands, which we're now much more used to, but at the time they were quite revolutionary, but it woke the allies up and it forced them to begin, yes, to pay up, to pay toward that 2% of GDP, but also to recognize that they really needed to restore defense capacity and capability in Europe per se. It's a long, slow road, and they're still in the midst of it now because things like the defense industries in Europe had fallen off, and they were not capable of producing modern weaponry. And by the way, NATO allies fight all the time about who's going to build the next fighter jet, right? So there's a lot of competition between the different industry establishments in the different NATO member states as to who's going to build the next shiny thing. So they need to work on interoperability, they need to work on cooperation, and they needed at that time to retool their defense production. But a lot of that has started now. And why is it? Trump started the momentum in his first term in office, but Vladimir Putin solidified it in 2022 with his second invasion of Ukraine. At that time, NATO allies were alert and indeed beginning to pay more attention to the necessity of military planning, the necessity of the practical matters that would need to be already in place and well practiced should there be an invasion by Russia of NATO. But I don't think they really believed, unlike perhaps our Baltic colleagues, but across NATO, I don't think many countries believe that NATO would be faced with that kind of aggression. But the 2022 invasion of Ukraine was a true wake-up call, and that has solidified the commitment of the NATO allies to building, as Gabrielius already mentioned, Steve actually mentioned, not only to 3% of GDP for acquisition of weapons, equipment, et cetera, but also up to 5% of GDP, that additional 1.5% devoted to not only to things like cyber resilience and very, very important realm, but also to things like building up the transportation mechanisms and infrastructure in Europe so that if reinforcement has to come, it can be done effectively and as efficiently as possible. So I think these are all very good decisions. Before I leave the floor, I want to really emphasize what Gabrielius had to say about hybrid warfare. This is where Russia has doubled down on Europe and the NATO European countries now. At the moment, I don't believe that bald-faced aggression using another invasion force. Russia doesn't have another invasion force. They burned up all their armored and tank capacity, right? But what they have is these hybrid methods of all kinds, the drone incursions. We're seeing them double down on this irregular warfare techniques, hybrid techniques, however you want to make it. So this is truly the burning threat facing the NATO allies now.
Colin, you've sort of had a perch both in the Obama administration and the Biden administration for the last 15 years. Can you talk about how the U.S. perspective has changed, bearing in mind that the U.S. looks at Europe as one of a number of security challenges around the world? And then if you want to comment a little bit on maybe the current administration and how much does the current president see Russia as a threat?
Okay, so hi, everybody. Yeah, so I was the Undersecretary for Policy at DoD from the spring of 2021 through the end of the summer of 2023. So I was there for the buildup to the Russian invasion, and then the first couple years of the response. I personally signed off on $43 billion of security assistance to Ukraine. So that, whether you think that's a good thing or a bad thing, I think it's a good thing. I was there for a lot of this stuff. My office oversaw the 2022 National Defense Strategy. And why do I mention that? Because that document, and its language is paralleled in the National Security Strategy as well, described Russia as an acute threat. It also described China as the pacing challenge. And I say both of that because it actually gives you a window into how the Biden administration thought of Russia and China differently. So China was described as the pacing challenge because looking at China, the Biden administration assessed that China was the only country that had the military, diplomatic, economic, and technological wherewithal, and increasingly the intention to displace the United States as the world's most influential and consequential actor. Pacing challenge. So our efforts had to be paced to China. Russia, in contrast, had no ability to rule the world, but they did have the ability to blow up the world. And increasingly had signaled that they were willing to take enormous risks to transgress the most fundamental norms and principles of the international order established after the Second World War about sovereignty and territorial integrity, to pressure and ultimately invade their neighbors to carve out a sphere of influence. And that was the view of Russia before the war in Ukraine. That language of Russia as an acute threat, I know, was in the National Defense Strategy document before the invasion. And of course, the invasion itself put an exclamation point on it. You know, I did work during the Obama administration, both at the Pentagon and at the White House. And obviously, President Obama was hopeful for a reset, right, with Russia. Not a completely kumbaya cooperative relationship, but a working relationship with Russia. And
Pragmatic.
a pragmatic relationship, especially one that could help reinforce strategic stability and buy down the risk of nuclear conflict between the world's two largest nuclear powers. Rose played a big role in helping us accomplish that through the New START Treaty. But there was a sense, basically, I mean, Obama basically called Russia a kind of middle-tier regional country that happened to have a lot of nuclear weapons, right? He kind of disparaged them as a threat to U.S. interests and believed, especially when Medvedev seemed to be at the head of the Russian state, that we could do business with the Russians. The Biden administration came in with no illusions that we should go back to a reset with Putin. When he was vice president and I worked for him, Biden used to tell this story. I have no idea if it's apocryphal or not, but he told it all the time. That, you know, it was a play on, do you remember when George W. Bush said he looked into Putin's eyes and could see his soul? Biden tells the story of sitting across from Putin when Biden was a senator and saying, Mr. President, I've looked into your eyes and I know you don't have a soul. Now, I don't know if that was true or not, but nevertheless, that's what Biden thought about it. He had no illusions about Putin. The goal, however, was to make the relationship with Russia stable and predictable. That is, to understand that it was going to be conflictual and competitive, but to try to make it stable and predictable. And he met with Putin in the summer of 2021 after Russia initially made some warnings about potentially invading Ukraine and marshaled a bunch of troops on Ukraine's border to kind of walk them back from that. And then in the fall of 2021, we started to get all this unbelievable intelligence that Putin was remobilizing his military with the intention of actually carrying out an all-out invasion of Ukraine. And from that point on, it was all hands on deck to try to mobilize the West and the broader international community to, in the first instance, dissuade Putin from doing it. We never thought that was particularly likely. But in the second instance, to make sure that Russia paid significant cost if they engaged in aggression and to rally support for defending Ukraine. I will say it wasn't really a question that Steve asked, but I'm often asked, why do you think Putin invaded Ukraine? You know, some of our political science colleagues, people like John Mearsheimer, have argued that Putin did this largely out of security fears, that Ukraine was about to be part of NATO, and that kind of pushed him to invade the country. I saw no indication of that based on the information that I was exposed to while in government. I think the much more plausible scenario is that Putin is an imperialist. He fantasizes about reconstituting the Russian Empire. There is no Russian Empire in his view that doesn't include Ukraine, in part because he thinks Ukraine is just Russia and isn't a real country. But and also, if you look at the map, historically, Ukraine is the strategic depth that Russia has against the challenges they face from Western Europe. And it wasn't that Putin believed that Ukraine was about to join NATO. Nobody believed that. They weren't about to join NATO. They probably were never going to join NATO, despite the 2008 statements to that effect. What Putin worried about, though, is that over time, Ukraine was drifting decisively into the orbit of NATO and the European Union. It was becoming fully integrated into the West, and therefore was slipping out of Russia's grasp. I do believe he believed that.
Mm-hmm.
I also think he looked at the West and thought the West was a bit wobbly. He saw NATO coming out of the Trump administration kind of beaten and demoralized. He saw Biden declare that America was back and to go all in on the transatlantic relationship, but then you had Afghanistan. You had the AUKUS kerfuffle with the French in the summer of 2021. But even more importantly, you had Merkel leaving the scene in Germany. You had an election upcoming in France. You had the winter approaching. And you had the fact that the Europeans did not respond very forcefully when Russia invaded Ukraine the first time in 2014. And so he looked and said, look, Ukraine is slipping away. I can't get my ambitions without claiming Ukraine. And now is my moment. And that's why I think he did what he did. It proved, to my mind, to be one of the greatest miscalculations that any leader has engaged in my lifetime. And I'll just give you a few statistics to prove that point out. The war has been devastating for Ukraine. They've lost about 20% of their population. It's been horrible for the soldiers on the front lines and the civilians behind. But the Russians have suffered 1 million casualties, probably 300,000 dead and 700,000 wounded. Their entire military, especially their army before the war, has essentially been decimated, to include the tanks and the forces that they had built up at enormous expense to threaten NATO. They now not only face 30 NATO countries, they face 32, and double the amount of territory along their frontier at a time when 90% of the Russian army remains stuck in Ukraine. They went after Ukraine thinking that Ukraine was pitiful and small, and now Ukraine is probably the second best military in Europe after the United States, and is likely to remain so for the foreseeable future. Their economy has been diminished and completely made lopsided. They're now dependent on countries like China and North Korea and Iran, and they are isolated from the West. So I believe that if Putin knew that that was how the war was going to turn out, he wouldn't have invaded Ukraine. Instead, he thought the war was going to be 2 weeks long. They'd spike the football. They'd go home. They'd be greeted like with flowers and sweets as liberators. We had fantasies like that too back in 2003. It almost never works out that way. But I will just say that I think net, the Russian threat in some ways is diminished from what it was back in 2022, in the sense that Russia is diminished. Russia is a weaker country. They are bigger, but weaker. And Ukraine, ironically, is smaller, but stronger than it was back then. But that doesn't mean that Russia isn't dangerous. They feel in some ways cornered. They're willing to take a lot of risk in hybrid and irregular forms of conflict, cyber, information, the drone incursions and everything else. And they do perceive at this moment an ability to drive wedges inside the Western alliance, both between the United States and NATO and between NATO and Ukraine. And I think the most important thing that the West can do in the face of this diminished but still acute threat is to show that Putin can actually drive those wedges, either between the United States and NATO or between NATO and Ukraine.
And just one, that's the Russian MO, right? And it was the Soviet MO before to drive wedges. That's always been there. And so there is a certain amount of preparedness in NATO to respond to that, but it has risen to new levels with this kind of hybrid assault going on now.
I just said I agree completely with Colin on the motive here. I mean, two things. Putin as an imperialist wanting to recover parts of the Russian Empire that were lost to Moscow in 1991 when the Soviet Union collapsed. The second part, the sense in the Kremlin that Ukraine was drifting out of Moscow's orbit, perhaps irretrievably. The irony being that if you look at the biggest element of that, Russia was doing more than anything else in a way, particularly after 2014 with the seizure of Crimea and Russian involvement in Donbass. So let's now take a look at the future. Maybe like 3 or 4 minutes each. Ukraine and Europe. There seems to be a common opponent there. So Gabrielius, how in the Baltic states, how do they look at the opportunities for Europe to work with Ukraine to develop a relationship that serves the security of both. And what does that mean institutionally? What links might be possible in that?
Well, so Baltic states have been traditionally a very strong advocates for inviting Ukraine to NATO and providing security guarantees to Ukraine, basically following up on 2008 promise. That's always been a very tough discussion and made even more tougher after 2022 invasion. Well, we look now, and I fully agree that now Ukraine is basically not just the second strongest army in Europe, but it is a major security provider to Europe because it holds about 1 million of Russian forces stuck in the front. Because we very well know that that Putin might choose to demobilize them in case of a ceasefire, but then he would risk, at least in his mind, he would think that he's risking losing territory to Ukrainian counterattack. So he's pinned. If he would win, if Ukraine would be unable to hold, the question is whether Putin would really try to demobilize, or whether he would try to put pressure on on some other country. It could be Moldova, it could be taking over Georgia if he still thinks that he needs that country. It's basically his, even without the military intervention, the new military intervention, or he could start putting pressure on NATO countries. So basically, Ukraine fighting for its territory, for the eastern parts of the territory, is Ukraine defending Europe. Europe assisting Ukraine now at the level, just let's remember, how the debate started and where it is now. So the first elements of support that the major European countries such as Germany was figuring out whether it could send to Europe was helmets. That is already after the invasion. Then we went from helmets to field hospitals, from field hospitals to the javelins, and all the way now nobody's debating. Now we're debating tomahawks. This is where debate is in 4 years. The question is, should there be any limits at all? My perception is that by debating these things, we put so much emphasis on each and every element that basically we allowed for Putin to create a narrative that sending a new piece of equipment is escalation. Well, we still got there, much slower, allowed a lot of Ukrainian civilians and military perish in the process, but we still got there. So in general, if I look back, I mean, Ukraine is already integrated into European security architecture. We depend on them, they depend on us, still rather significantly on equipment that we send. So the integration is already happening. I usually get a question. So is it still imperative for Ukraine to become part of NATO? I believe that it is incredibly difficult now to push that discussion because even President Trump has been, well, you could say that he was already unambiguous that this is not going to happen. But the question is, that I reverse the question. So if Lithuania would be, or any Baltic state would be attacked, would we rather defend our countries together with Ukrainians or without Ukrainians? And I can tell you that every country on the eastern flank would tell you we would very much like a competent, equipped Ukrainian brigade, division, army corps standing together with us because they are the only ones who fought Russians and are, well, rather successful in that. Right? They know the war. Our last war was Afghanistan. Very different terrain, very different war, very different environment. Of course, we would learn, but Ukrainians are already knowing that. So again, as trying to find a political language to that, I asked the question whether Ukraine would be would accept us into any sort of alliance that it would start creating in the Central and Eastern Europe, kind of a bulwark against Russia. So, but that could be left in the political domain. But really, I mean, if we look at it from the practical perspective, we are already intertwined. And I think that going forward would only be, we would see more of that. And last point, maybe a tiny reaction to what was said. I think that, and myself including, I think that we still base the current geopolitical environment in the thinking of the previous Cold War. The West versus Russia, trying to balance the powers in Europe, where I have a sense that the environment has changed, where basically the alliance between China and Russia is such that we have to start thinking in terms of balancing not Russia, but challenging that alliance. 80% of Russia's military output today is based on Chinese equipment. This is not a coincidence. This is not a fluke. It is a deliberate strategy that shows where China currently is and how it sees the conflict. And that should tell us that we are no longer just helping Ukraine to figure out to regain its territory or provide it a stronger, a better position for future negotiations. Basically, it's a beginning of a new phase, somebody call it Cold War 2.0, but I'm not sure whether that's really the name, because it's not yet, we're not yet sure what that will be called. And so many other questions remain unanswered. But I think it starts, unfortunately, in Ukraine, the next global Western and non-Western standoff competition.
Rose, there's been a long relationship between NATO and Ukraine going back to, I guess, 1994, when Ukraine was one of the first countries to join up to the Partnership for Peace. In 1997, you had the establishment of a distinctive partnership between NATO and Ukraine. And I think the last NATO pronouncement at the summit in 2023 was that Ukraine is on an irreversible path to membership.
Correct.
So can you talk about NATO-Ukraine?
I'm taking on my colleague here.
And
Thank you, Gabrielius.
How far they may be going?
Yes, a couple of things. First of all, the Trump administration, they don't calibrate anything all that carefully, but I would say the predominant talking point with regard to this matter of NATO's membership for Ukraine is that Ukraine's NATO membership cannot be part of this war termination package. That's what Pete Hegseth said back in February. So they've essentially taken it off the table. But the president has come closer, and so I agree with that notion. The president has come closer to just saying it's not going to happen. Okay, but as far as I understand, they have not wanted it to be part of the current negotiation as they have visualized it. In that context, I repeatedly emphasize just leave the 2008 decision intact, leave it there, but work on what can be accomplished right now, and that is Ukraine's EU membership. I find it so very ironic that what started this whole brouhaha back in 2012, 2013 was Ukraine moving toward an association agreement with the EU. And that's what led to the first invasion of Ukraine in 2014, with all the politics that were going on there in Ukraine and between Ukraine and Russia. But it was all about EU membership. But Peskov himself from the Kremlin podium has said, oh, we don't mind about EU membership, go for it. And so as a result of this, Union. It's going to be a long, slow, and difficult process, but my view is that everything that Ukraine does to prepare itself for EU membership will down the road serve it well. Maybe it's 10 years, maybe it's 20 years, certainly after Vladimir Putin has left the scene, but eventually it can and should become a member of NATO. So I just leave it like that. But I'm glad, meanwhile, that we have a process going on for Ukraine's EU accession that's already officially launched by the European Union, and it's going to be tough. Can you imagine EU agricultural policy and how much it's going to have to adjust to take Ukraine into the EU? So there are a lot of tough issues for the EU to wrestle with, but nevertheless, Ukraine in that context, I think, can play an enormous role in the upcoming security architecture of Europe, working together with the European Union as well as its everybody in NATO wanted to find out how they could. There's this inherent relationship now that NATO must take advantage to learn from what Ukraine has learned in fighting this very new modern warfare in Ukraine, and also taking advantage of what is a well-established now defense industrial infrastructure in Ukraine that can and should provide some of this capability and capacity to the NATO allies. So there's a feedback loop there that I think is also quite beneficial. But actually, I'd never thought about it, Gabrielius, but if Russia would invade my country today, I would be very glad to have a Ukrainian brigade or more helping out.
Might be tough for them to get here.
I know, but we faced that going the other way, right? We could help that.
You just referred to the forgery.
Right.
Okay, Colin, the American perspective. And what role do you see Washington playing this developing relationship between Ukraine and Europe?
I would actually zoom out and not make it about Ukraine and Europe, but to Gabrielle's point, modern geopolitics is a team sport. The Russian challenge is not in isolation. The Russians are working more collaboratively and are more interdependent and entangled with China, North Korea, and Iran than ever before. Now, for a long time, those four countries have tried to counterbalance what they perceive to be U.S. unipolarity. They want to usher in a multipolar world. All those countries want to carve out spheres of influence in their neighborhoods. They want the Americans to leave. They want American alliances in their neighborhoods to fall apart. None of that is new. What is new is that Russia's invasion of Ukraine didn't work out very well for Russia, which forced them to rely on China first economically, then for components like microelectronics for their satellites, and increasingly for a whole host of military hardware. They had to turn to Iran for drones. They had to turn to North Korea for missiles and artillery shells. So
And personnel.
And personnel. And so, that's why people have started to talk about, the axis of upheaval or an alignment of autocrats, or I prefer the Legion of Doom, but whatever you call it, they're leveling each other up. They're helping each other militarily, they're helping each other technologically, and they're increasingly integrating their defense industrial bases. And that is real. The Russian economy has been diminished, but it's also been completely reoriented to war. And so that is not a challenge that the United States can face by itself. It's not a challenge Europe can face by itself. And frankly, it's not a challenge that the United States, Europe can face together. It's one in which the free world has to face together. That means the United States, it means NATO, it means Ukraine, but it also means our allies in the Indo-Pacific, Japan, South Korea, Australia, the Philippines, and others. I think one of the things that has not, been written about enough, but was, I think, a huge triumph during the Biden administration is how much the Indo-Pacific allies actually showed up to provide Ukraine assistance, to pile in on sanctions, to provide economic support, humanitarian support, and military support, sometimes quietly, sometimes not, but because they saw a stake in all of that. So my concerns about the Trump administration, I think there's some good stuff and bad stuff going on. The good news first. The president's threats of abandonment and tariffs have worked to force the allies to do some things. They have twisted the arms of the allies to do some things that are really important. NATO showing up with this 5% pledge, even if they only get to half of that, that's a meaningful increase for what it has been. Europe is a real place with a real economy and a real technological capacity. They've needed to level up on defense for a long time. There had been progress in Trump 1, more progress in Biden. And if there's more progress in Trump 2, we should all applaud that. Europe needs to be more capable and needs to stand on its own 2 feet and carry more of the burden. Amen to that. The second, I think the threat of abandonment and tariffs has encouraged a lot of our allies, not just in Europe, but in the Indo-Pacific, to make more investments in our collective defense industrial base. So you saw, for example, South Korea is going to make substantial investments in shipyards in Philadelphia. You saw agreements with Australia on critical minerals and rare earths, all to the good. We should be we should see the defense industrial base of the free world as a collective good of the free world. The challenge is that those have come in response to very coercive tactics, the threat of abandonment and the weaponization of economic interdependence in the form of tariffs. And that calls into question the core currency of alliances, which is trust. And so the good news, the things that have been a benefit of the Trump administration have come at the expense of trust within the alliance and a degree of credibility that the United States will actually defend the allies. And that is especially problematic from the point of deterrence. So I think whether it's the second half of this Trump administration or whatever administration comes next, I think the onus is to lean into the good things, more defense spending, more defense industrial base integration. That's our team. We all need to level up while reaffirming the ironclad, non-transactional nature of our Article 5 commitments, not only in Europe, but in the Indo-Pacific. And if you can have a president who does both of those things together, then actually we will emerge from this process stronger, more united, and more capable. And by the way, whose team would you rather be on? Right? Like if it is a team sport and it's Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran versus the United States, all of Europe, plus Japan, South Korea, Australia, and a bunch of countries in the Indo-Pacific, it's not close. Which team is more capable of defending itself and making the world a better place? So let's get after it.
Okay, we have about 40 minutes for questions. I'll start taking those questions. For those of you online, if you can enter the questions in the Q&A, I'll try to get to some of those as well. But I'm going to add a lightning third round. And all you need to do is give me a number. The question is
5.
Not that
Okay.
I want a percentage.
Googleplex.
What are the odds that in 5 to 10 years, a range time, 5 to 10 years, Ukraine will be in NATO?
Oof.
Just a number.
I wish it was higher. I cannot answer it with a simple number. The thing is that I think that NATO will be reformed. It will find so Ukraine will most likely be part of a new emerging European security that could be based on current NATO. It could be parallel to NATO. It could be something else. So whether Ukraine will be allied with the West, yes, I believe that is 95%. Whether that is current NATO structures that exist, that is rather low chance.
I think Iran must be something different Lithuanian, but that's okay.
Sorry about
Rose.
that. Sorry.
Okay, I'll give it 10% if Vladimir Putin is gone from the Kremlin.
5%. I think Putin has to be gone, but probably Orban does too. Getting agreement at 32 is going to be really hard.
He's got a tough election coming up.
Okay, let's open it.
Do we have okay, good. Thanks, Tracy.
Martin Saywell, Stanford DCI 24, DCI Flow Scholar 25. So it's a question for Gabrielius, which is, can we talk about money? So The Economist recently said that Ukraine is likely to run a budget deficit of $50 billion next year. And to keep it in the field and functioning as a government over the next 4 years, there'll be a requirement of $450 to $500 billion. There's $210 billion of Russian assets sitting in Euroclear in Belgium. It still leaves a shortfall of $260, $270 billion over 4 years, 5 years, assuming no money is coming from the Americans anymore. Do you think there's the political will in Europe to do collective debt financing, like the COVID financing, which was a big number, 800 billion, for instead of fixing Italian roofs, to actually fix collective European security?
Excellent question. And yeah, indeed, you are very right that in view of COVID threat, Europe mobilized and for the first time was able to borrow as a union and borrowed enormous amount, that so much that it wasn't even able to spend it. So the leftovers were transformed into the defense fund of Europe of 150 billion euros. This is a leftover from COVID. But when you look at 4 years of war, Europe has not been able to mobilize any serious finance as a union, either to defend itself or to defend its ally, Ukraine. So this is one of the major points that keeps me worried, and the reason why I mentioned that, especially money, that we will. It's that the new budgetary year starts, fiscal year starts very soon. We will see whether there is some money to that, and unfortunately now there is none. Nothing serious that is being put on the table. European Union will able, because the thing that will continue is the macro-financial assistance that helps. Europe has been doing that. It is a long-term commitment. We will continue doing that. But when it comes to defense, that is a major question. I think that we've mobilized for this year. We've covered the losses that the American losses. Next year, I'm not so sure. I'm really not so sure. And you're right. There is 190+ billion euros in Euroclear. There was an amazing project that was proposed to leverage that, basically to borrow on that, use that as a collateral. But as you know, Belgium has blocked that. Well, at least publicly saying that they're not sure who is going to return the money back. And if, for example, now the plan is that Russia, it will be part of the peace negotiations, basically forcing sometime in the future Russians to pay off the debt, the European debt that is taken, against their frozen money. The Belgians are asking, what if Ukraine or Russia refuses to do that? What if Ukraine is unable to do that? So is it Belgium that has to repay the debt to the bank? And they refuse to do anything without the European support. And here again, in Europe, unfortunately, we just don't have a consensus that Europe would be ready to do that. So it is rather gloomy in this regard.
It's clear to me that Ukraine, either the government or the people themselves, are taking EU accession seriously. The corruption institutions have been building up some momentum under difficult circumstances. And the people have responded immediately when Zelensky floated the idea of compromising corruption institutions, and they immediately mobilized on the ground. So it's clear that the vast majority in Ukraine are looking west. My question is really about EU accession and the extent to which Orban, should he survive politically in his domestic challenges, act as a spoiler in EU accession.
Right. Well, I will begin. Gabrielius, who knows the EU machinations very, very well, might have a comment also. Again, because of all the chapters that have to be worked through, and I mentioned the agricultural chapter, but on the security side there, and issues related to budget and financing and so forth, there's a lot, and it's very complicated. And my view is you should have asked Steve how long it's going to take for them to get into the EU, just getting through the negotiating process. So, but I welcome it because it is time to work on the major issues that have so concerned the West about Ukraine, and corruption is probably at the head of that list. So it gives them time, and the Ukrainian society time, to push through what needs to be done in terms of solidifying a response to corruption and the rule of law in their own country. So I welcome this very, very much. But my main argument here is that process is important at this moment. And this process, just as we've been saying, is drawing Ukraine toward Europe and toward European institutions in a way that I never would have predicted, certainly a decade and a half ago, when they were going for the association agreement. And this was in Russia. Now, maybe, and we could say cynically, maybe they just figured the EU will never be able to figure it out, and that Orban will stand in the way, and so they don't really think that this is the concern it was in 2012. But the process is underway, and it is legally in train, and it is sanctioned by the Kremlin, for God's sake. So, in a positive sense. So let's go for it. Is my point of view on this. I don't know if you want to add anything, Gabrielius.
Right. Another set. That would work, but the outcome that's a fact.
Now, I have a certain confidence in their bureaucratic cleverness in that organization. Often it works, sometimes it doesn't. So
Hi, I'm Alan Weiner from the law school. After the full-scale invasion of 2022, I think many of us were heartened by the incredibly widespread response of the international community. A lot of the media reported unprecedented levels of sanctions against Russia. I'm not really sure that's true given what happened after Iraq's invasion of Kuwait. But in any event, this all seemed like something that was going to bring Russia to its knees. And I was struck by Colin's comment that Russia is weaker, and I think in many respects geopolitically that's true. But I've been surprised at how resilient the Russian economy has been, and we read lots of debates in the literature about whether sanctions have harmed Russia or not. But I mean, we see inflation is high, but employment has remained strong. Foreign companies have been kind of converted into Russian companies, and it seems like average Russians are not feeling the price so much of all of these very, very extensive sanctions. So I'm wondering what the panel's views are about, have the sanctions bit, and if I'm right that they have not had as much bite as we might have hoped, why is that?
I mean, I'll sorry, I'm not an economist. I'm barely a political scientist. But I'll say this: I mean, there's not a lot of history to suggest that sanctions alone are sufficient course of pressure to achieve, regime change or maximalist war aims. Countries can experience a lot of pain. I think that a couple of things. I think the sanctions were severe and certainly unprecedented against a country of Russia's size and importance in the world. But ultimately incomplete, in part because because of the energy dependencies that the Europeans had on Russia. It took time to try to disentangle that, and even it wasn't until the Trump administration, just in the last few weeks, that actually some of the largest energy producers in Russia were really completely targeted. And I will say, the United States also was nervous about moving all of Russian oil and gas off the market because of the economic consequences it would have. So, the sanctions were always incomplete. But even had they been complete, I mean, look, I think we have to understand, like, Russia has gone through extraordinary pain in its history, losing tens of millions of people, and they fight on. And I think the Putin government has done a really good job of making sure that that pain is not felt by the average citizen in Moscow and St. Petersburg. And that's true economically. It's also true in terms of the blood that's been spilled in the war, where most of the soldiers dying and being maimed are from the hinterlands and are not ethnic Russians. But I think it's actually come at quite a cost. I think one of the challenges to ending the war now is not that Russia is not facing an economic pain, but that Russia's entire economy has been reoriented towards a war economy. And I think that there might be part of Putin that worries how his economy can function if they're not at war, which is its own kind of paradoxical effect on things. And the Russians are also being propped up by China and other places. So I think it's maybe a combination of all those things, and I'm sure people who know more about economics than me would have broader answers to that. But I've always believed that economic issues would be important, but mostly in the end game of negotiations, if the things you could lift, right, they become carrots that you can give the Russians at the end. But that the real pain was going to come on the battlefield, that the recognition that the Russians simply could not achieve their objectives militarily at a cost that they could bear over the long term. And I think objectively, if Vladimir Putin thinks he can take all of Ukraine, he's trapped in as much of a fantasy as he was the day he invaded the country. Like, that's not going to happen. It's equally fantastical to believe that Ukraine's going to claw back every inch of their territory. That's not going to happen either. But what we need is for both sides, but in the particular moment, the Russian side to conclude that they can get more at the negotiating table than they can get at the battlefield, and on the battlefield, and they just haven't reached that conclusion yet. But that's going to be a military equation, not an economic one, in my view.
I'd like to just make two small comments here. First of all, what worries me about I think the sanctions have bitten, and they've bitten increasingly when it's been combined with the attacks on oil and gas infrastructure in Russia, where Ukraine has been very successful. So there's a kind of increasing effect of the sanctions really starting to bite. But the Russians have also been masterful, and I think they are feeding off what's going on elsewhere at sanctions busting, and they have perfected certain techniques that it's been a cat and mouse game. Then the Biden administration was chasing this, how to shut down the ghost fleet that was moving Russian gas and oil around. So it's been a cat and mouse game, but it's also a game that's being played by others like North Korea. So I fear this kind of feedback loop of effectiveness in sanctions busting that will affect the sanctions tool going forward, and we need to be thinking about that. The other thing I'll say, just as a quick comment, is the incredible effectiveness and talent of the team at the central bank. They have done an extraordinary job under the governor, Elvira Nabiullina. A lot of those people were trained in Western universities, top Western institutions. They know finance, trade, and economics, and good for them. But because, as I've understood, they have said, we need to keep this economy alive so people aren't starving and this doesn't spiral down. But it's not a decision I would like to have had to make as a young Russian talented financier to be involved in this kind of situation. But you gotta give them credit for what they've been able to do to keep the economy perking along, so at least consumer goods, food, etc., are available.
Can I follow up on that question? Not so much the economic thing, but Colin, you mentioned the casualties, 300,000 perhaps killed in action, another 700,000, 800,000 wounded in action. In the 1980s, 15,000 Soviet soldiers killed in Afghanistan generated the Mothers Committee and a huge internal push.
It's really true.
I'm surprised we haven't seen that. Does anybody have a sense of why we haven't seen the public reacting? Just because the bulk of the casualties are falling on non-ethnic Russians? Why hasn't there been a public outcry about the number of killed?
Thumb down also on civil society by Putin. I mean, much more so than we saw at the end of the Soviet era.
Stalin's approach, basically.
Yeah.
I also just think, I think this will be something that dissertations will be written about for a long time. I mean, we're now talking about, the Russians have suffered more casualties in 3 years of fighting in Ukraine than they suffered in Afghanistan, plus both wars in Chechnya put together, like several orders of magnitude more than all of that. And it did have an effect at the end of the Soviet Union. Now, it was also intersecting with a bunch of other things that were happening at the end of the as the Soviet Union approached its imperial dissolution. I think in this case, part of it is demographic, where the soldiers are coming from, but part of it is also that in the places where the soldiers are coming from, the benefits that the soldiers are getting from serving and the death benefits that are going to families, it's also helping to drive down the grievances. And so if you're so desperate that you're signing up knowing that you're going to get 2 weeks of training and going to be used in these human wave attacks because it's the best paycheck in town, and if you die, your family will be okay, I think that has helped.
Well, Putin has also worked up this message, and there's a horrific statement he made to a group of mothers whose sons have been killed, and he essentially said to them, well, look, your sons could have died as alcoholics, but instead they died in service to the motherland as great patriots, So he's worked up this, to me as a mother, this is a horrific message, but I think it goes with those death benefits, and they get to buy a refrigerator, so it's...
I don't know, personally, I vote drinking myself to death, but but probably in bourbon, not vodka.
Hi, Alana, a former master's degree recipient from Georgetown School of Foreign Service. I appreciated hearing your thoughts on NATO's deterrence or ability to effectively deter Russia being damaged by the US administration's comments about Article 5 and whatnot. So under the auspices that the damage would last to the diplomatic connective tissue of NATO until potentially after this US administration. Could you talk a little bit about what it would look like to start building back that trust within the alliance and what the US could potentially do? That may be an unfair question given the circumstances we're in, but curious to hear what you
It's not unfair at all. I think about that all the time. I want to hear how Colin and Gabrielius would answer this question too, but I do think there's been an effectiveness in how NATO has responded thus far that has in itself had a deterrent effect. The alliance has shown that it is ready, willing, and able to show up for these drone incursions, for example, the way they responded very quickly with what is essentially well-practiced Baltic air policing. And people have complained they're using F-35s to shoot down drones. Yes, that is a criticism. We need to work that problem. We need cost-effective drone defense. But the fact that NATO showed up immediately with not only Poland and its F-16s, but the F-35s from the Netherlands, Italy's AWACS plane, Patriot systems, et cetera, and refueling capacity, the NATO alliance responded as a whole in very real time. I mean, rapid. And so this is very well practiced around the Baltic Sea, also in the Black Sea with Black Sea air policing. It's the wrong answer to the drone threat. I grant you that. But it has a deterrence effect when NATO shows it can be responding quickly and together. So that's my at the moment, incomplete answer. So I'd like to hear what my colleagues have to say.
So I'm a bit less optimistic about this than Rose, mostly because I believe that, so we are caught in this conundrum, as it was said, that on one hand, the pressure that Europe is undergoing currently from the current administration in Washington really boosts up our ability to, and understanding that we need to do something more. So there is new money coming in. There is a German fund of $500 billion, which is serious and real money. So things are changing. But at the same time, if Putin believed that alliance is shaky when he decided to attack in 2022, and I agree with that analysis, I think that he believes the same thing now, especially with the new administration, that he is thinking that the commitments are weaker. And that can tempt him to testing. And there is additional factor in this. In Europe, we tend to mark deadlines, markers as to when we are going to be prepared. So usually it's like, so we need 7 years, we need 10 years. And even, European leaders are telling that, well, in 10 years, Europe will be as strong as, or, ready to take on any, Russian challenge. That is a horrible way to advertise, because basically it tells additionally that, well, we are now definitely not at a position to deter. We are now not in a position to defend. And Putin, well, I mean, if war would stop with Ukraine in his favor, right, that he would get what he wants, that leaves him with 1.2 or 1.3 million people army, and the knowledge that Europe, well, is not yet ready. So this makes us in a very dangerous timeline from now until we are actually ready and prepared to deter. So this, how to change that, your question was. I mean, and things, United States has a privilege, I would say, to get accepted back very quickly. When people need United States, they usually forgive, forget, invite, roll out the red carpets and all the other things. Just look like, what happens with Ukraine. When President Trump, turns around, says a nice word, people cheer, right? This is the right thing. So, I mean, if there was a tiny change, where with troops remaining in Europe,
Your question is super important, and I think there are deep structural factors going on here that I don't think we should dismiss. So now I'm going to put my IR theorist hat on for a moment. Why do alliances form and why do they sustain themselves? Well, principally they form for the realist reasons. Why did they survive? Because over the course of several decades, the alliance was undergirded by other dynamics. It was highly institutionalized, right? Which meant that smooth day-to-day cooperation. It also gave what economists would call a lengthy shadow of the future, where people believed that their interactions today, their disagreements today, could over the long term, the United States would remain committed to the institutions of the alliance. There was a strong bipartisan consensus that also sent a signal in that direction. That's the second. A third factor was high degrees of economic interdependence and entanglement that meant that we had a shared economic fate with Europe. And the fourth was a set of common values, a sense that NATO was not just an alliance, it was the heart, the beating heart of the democratic community of nations. There was a sense of kind of collective identity or we-ness to it, right? Which is why NATO didn't die after the end of the Cold War. NATO expanded after the end of the Cold War. I think we need to understand the challenge that the second Trump administration poses as a challenge at the structural level of all four of those factors. We do not agree as an alliance on what the greatest threats are. We don't. Europe sees Russia as the number one threat. The United States right now does not see Russia as the number one threat. It's not even clear on any given day whether the president sees Russia as a threat at all. But even if they see Russia as a threat, there's a big debate about what the biggest threat to the United States is. And in the United States, the bipartisan weight of the room is that China is the biggest threat. On the White House, in most days, the biggest threats are homeland defense, the enemy within, and the Western Hemisphere, right? So
Democrats.
that's the enemy within. Okay, stay on target. All right. So we don't agree on the fundamentals of the threat. In terms of institutionalization, Trump has basically rejected the institutional commitments of Article 5 and made them purely transactional. You don't pay up, we don't defend you, and even if you do pay up, we may not defend you. In terms of economic interdependence, it's been weaponized against Europe and our allies in Asia to threaten tariffs, to deny American markets, to coerce our allies to do things we want. And some of that is good for them, like spending more on their defense, but some of it is good for us, like investing behind the tariff wall in American industries. That makes the economic interdependence seem much more like a one-way street. And then on the values question, A, there's a lot of creeping illiberalism across the Western alliance. But B, even to the degree that we think of ourselves as democracies, we don't agree on what that democracy is, right? So see the Vice President Vance's speeches in Europe castigating Europe for being essentially socialist and non-democratic. And of course, they look at us and they don't see us as a democracy very much either. And so these problems are not to be papered over by like a president saying, and I do think the Europeans will welcome us back because to some degree there isn't an alternative. But I think that there are deep structural problems in this alliance that will not be easily fixed. Okay, the good news. I do think that there are opportunities for Europe spending more on its defense, but also becoming more industrially interdependent with the United States in terms of our defense industrial bases and our supply chains and things like that, that could create win-win situations that give the United States a political stake in maintaining the alliance and therefore make the alliance more credible. We should lean into that maximally so that people don't have to take us by our word, they take us by our interests, by our economic interests, not just our security interests. So I would really lean into that in addition to saying the right things, showing up in the institutions. And most importantly, I think there will be an opportunity for the next president to work with Congress to reassert a bipartisan support for our alliances, which I actually think is stronger than the MAGA voices would make you
That's
think.
absolutely true.
So I do think there's room for us to change the mood, the vibe of the alliance back to the way it was, but that won't be enough because the problems are more structural.
Wait a minute. Before we leave this, I just want to ask both of you, and maybe, okay, I grant you, I tend to be the world's greatest optimist, but the thing about these efforts that have gone on in terms of responding to these hybrid threats is that Europe has said, if we need to step forward by ourselves, we don't like it, but if we need to step forward by ourselves, we can, we must, we will. But you seem, both of you, to say, forget it, that's not.
I actually think I want to hear your view as being on the frontline state, but my view is, yeah, Europe has a lot of catch up to do, and they don't have an infinite amount of time, but they have some time. Okay, Russia is trapped for the foreseeable future in Ukraine. They are trapped. Whether the war continues or the war ends, they are trapped. 90% of their army is in Ukraine. The second thing is they do not have an army capable of sweeping across Europe. They have missiles, but they don't have an army. They have drones, but they don't have an army. They cannot sweep over Western Europe, period, full stop. And their air force sucks compared to NATO's air force. So Europe should also feel confident that from a pure deterrence perspective, they can deter Putin for a meaningful period of time while they build themselves up. That doesn't prevent the hybrid stuff, doesn't prevent the information warfare, weaponizing migrants, cyber shenanigans with special forces or anything, or drones or all the rest. But from a pure deterrence perspective, come on. Russia has the economy the size of Spain. Okay, so like, let's be real. Europe needs to show some confidence.
Yeah, and okay, we're on the same page.
Right. Yeah. Well,
European now.
yeah. Well, in essence, I absolutely agree, and I'm just finishing an op-ed that should show up next week in hopefully in New York Times, where I'm saying that Europe has lost the ability to believe in itself, which is ridiculous. Really, to add to that, I mean, 40 million Ukraine was able to stop Russia at in its track. 450 million Europe is unable really to offer meaningful deterrence. But so is there ability? Clearly there is ability. If there is a chance, absolutely there is a chance. But will it happen? But that is my biggest worry. We'll have elections in France. German government's under duress. United Kingdom is not in the best position. Even countries that have been shining examples, such as Poland, again, now caught in the duality of powers, where the president belongs to one power and the government to another coalition. So it is tough. And for 4 years, we have not witnessed a meaningful change in the way that Europe is preparing to deter. That means that our thinking is still based that that there is a sixth fleet somewhere in the North Atlantic. We will swim over.
You mean the stuff that's off the coast of Venezuela?
Yeah, exactly. The same.
To make sure we're talking.
So it will sail over to the Baltic Sea, and and that's deterrence. And that's the thinking in Baltic states. That's the thinking in Brussels, and that's the thinking in many countries. Now, going back, I agree with one thing. So your question was about how to change back, right? And I believe that the change could happen if there is a political will and understanding that this is imperative in Washington. But if it isn't, then we are already at the brink of rather wide schism. And one practical element in this, one of the things that happened since February, the famous speech and speeches, I would say, is that Europe is stopping to purchase US weaponry. That is a change already. Germans are clearly rebuilding their industry. They will be investing in their equipment. They will be inventing new elements, competing with the US, not sending money over. Imagine that process 10 years if the schism gets wider, right? That means that we will be within NATO. The NATO might survive, but we will be having two systems: European system, self-funded, self-industry, our industry, we're funding it, we're independent, and American. And that will affect the decisions, the way that we will fight future wars, the way that we will assist each other, and so many other things. Afghanistan, we were effective. Why? Because most of the things were running on American equipment. Even Lithuania, tiny Lithuania, had 600 soldiers contingent in Afghanistan, all American equipment. And we brought it back, and we trained other people. So basically, we were part of the, under one umbrella. Now, what is being offered? Having two, and that will change not just military industry, but geopolitics as well.
Okay, we have a question here from online, and it comes down to the Russian information space is pretty closed. As Roger did, they put the thumb down on the civil society system. Are there ways the West could more effectively, though, get information into the Russian public so they could better understand the numbers that Colin was throwing out, the fact that there are a significant number of countries, backing Ukraine, that this war is not exactly as it's being portrayed by Russian media?
You're looking at me. One of the great things that I mourn about is that at the height of the Cold War, we had so much cultural exchange going on with the USSR. After the thaw in the 1950s, we had an extraordinary opportunity to begin to talk, and our mechanisms for doing that, like Voice of America, were very effective, I know, at opening up an audience for a different form of news and information in the USSR at the time. So our soft power has diminished very strongly in this administration. I regret it very, very much, but we can think cleverly about this nevertheless. And I know the European Union is continuing to think about how to influence the information space in the Russian Federation. And I just think we need to think about doing that in whatever way we can, making clever use of the technologies that are available, VPNs and all that type of thing. But it's not a very pretty picture from the point of view of what for the United States was a long and well-established and well-developed tradition of trying to influence audiences all over the world, but in closed societies particularly, for the better from our perspective in terms of knowledge and understanding of the role of democracy and the principles that are so important in the UN Charter, and making sure people had an alternative in terms of information available to them.
Part of it is, so there may be vehicles for telling our story, but we also have to have a story to tell.
That's part of the problem now.
And I think a big challenge is that the United States has always been an imperfect democracy and an imperfect superpower. But on our best days, we were still better than many. And it doesn't feel like that very much.
That's a perfect.
And I think that it's very difficult if people have real, genuine questions about the trajectory of American democracy. The United States is moving faster towards illiberalism than any of the countries we normally list: Erdogan's Turkey, Orban's Hungary, Putin's Russia. We're moving faster in that, and people around the world see that. Meanwhile, we're engaged in extrajudicial killings in the Caribbean and threatening to invade Venezuela and threatening our NATO allies to take Greenland. I mean, it's bananas. Okay, so if at the end of the day, the United States is just a big normal country, not an exceptional democracy, then it actually doesn't matter how we tell our story, because we won't have a good story to tell.
I will answer this question from the Russian side. During the Cold War, there were two realities: Soviet reality, which was Potemkin's reality, for those who know the word, fake, painted over, and not real. And then there was a reality that was in the West, that was real reality. People talking real things. And the best part was that we were able, my parents, my grandparents would listen to radio, Voice of Free Europe, Voice of America, Radio Vatican, the radio station that I remember that would kind of ring around the house, that would bring that truth. And you compare it to something that is happening outside, and you understand, okay, so this is true. This is what we want more of. This is freedom. This is freedom of speech. Now, what Putin did, basically, he destroyed the people's ability to distinguish between lying and truth.
Yeah.
He says, well, everybody lies. I lie. I don't have to hide it. It's politics, right? It's show me a politician who doesn't, who hasn't lied in his world, right? So what you hear from the West, it's more of the same. You can doubt it, you can reject it. So that means that he's no longer that much worried about what comes through the border. because people will just doubt it. They will hear about us, about our freedoms, and they will say, well, maybe it's not true. And then, yes, especially if they hear about not so, not such a nice stories from us, they will amplify that as an example. You see, this is what's happening. And so the information sphere is messed up. This is it. This is no longer binary. There is no truth and not truth. That is the problem. The way to the only idea that I had in my mind that could potentially work, and I actually raised this in a couple of occasions when I had conversations with US officials when I was minister. What worked in Russia was actually late Navalny's attempt to show what Putin is stealing. So he wouldn't go against morals. He wouldn't, show geopolitics. I mean, to an extent where it's even, uncanny to the Western viewer. But he would show the palace. He would show the car. He would explain how much this coat,
Would he show the Qatari jet? Oh, sorry, that's the.
Yeah. So and it worked. Right, so you have videos, Navalny's videos, that have garnered, tens of millions of views, and most of the views come from Russia.
Mhm.
And that was probably the reason why, why he perished why he was killed in Russian jail. If there is a way that we can amplify that, use that as a megaphone, different sort of information. Like, this is where you guys live, and if and this is how much money they have. If we have that ability, because I'm pretty sure that they still use our banking systems to an extent. There are names that they call London. I don't know whether they still do that or not, right? Because of access, the access the Russian oligarchs had in the banking system. If we have able to make it transparent, show to Russian people, that might have an effect.
Okay, I think we have time for one last question.
Hi, my name is Nina. I'm a social media influencer from Ukraine. You just talked about informational sphere in Russia. My question is about informational sphere outside of Russia. I would assume that future decisions on Europe's security would somewhat depend on the stand which people in Europe have on the war in Ukraine. A part of Russia's efforts and propaganda is to get more people around the world to be okay with what they do, and not to be strongly on the side of Ukraine. And I read a lot of comments under many videos. And my question is, what, in your opinion, are the most effective ways through social media to fight against people around the world supporting Russia's imperialistic views, or maybe be like wishy-washy and like not clear which side should they take in the war?
Let me start on that, because I wanted to pick up on this last conversation and Gabrielius' important point about really showing the stealing that's going on, and that amazing video of the Sochi dacha mansion house, unbelievable. So I think that's a good idea, but I'm also very aware that there is a wide-ranging concern about information integrity and what is truth based in the face of massive misinformation, disinformation campaigns on social media and even in mainstream media constantly nowadays. So how to address this? I do want to say that I'm aware there's a lot of try to tackle these problems of misinformation, disinformation, and really to emphasize the necessity of informing the public about the necessity to be a critical thinker in terms of information integrity. What is happening? Teach children in schools to have some awareness that their views are being manipulated, perhaps, and they need to be asking questions about the sources of information. It's a huge job. It's not only apropos to our discussion tonight, but I think
is a combination of gaslighting and what? So gaslighting is the things you see are not what you see. Truth that you believe is not the truth. In fact, there is no truth. Don't believe your own eyes. Don't believe your own experiences. To just deny the reality that you're experiencing. Pure gaslighting. But then to fall back to whataboutism. And if you believe that we commit aggression, okay, so does everybody else. If you believe that we're authoritarian, and everybody is clamping down on democracy. If you believe that we're corrupt, they're all corrupt. And so strategy way, if you believe something about us, everybody else is doing it anyway. That's a really hard thing to push back on, and it's going to need authentic voices on the ground, like yourself, to do it. It probably has to be organic and authentic from inside. But I'll tell you, as an American, we can't push back on gaslighting if we deny the truth ourselves, if we deny the possibility of truth. And we can't push back on whataboutism if we're perceived as aggressors, if we're perceived as authoritarians, and if we're perceived as corrupt. So it may not be sufficient.
Still get support from the West. There's an alliance for the Ukraine. It's slow. It's, not in the best shape, but it's still there. And it all started because he said something that he believed in that Ukraine has to do. And it gives me hope that basically with a message from a country that is outside the institutions of European continent was able to seep into the minds of politicians, into the minds of people, that provide the mandate to the politicians, that goes beyond the electoral period, because it's been longer in many countries that we have new governments that are continuing to support Ukraine. So not all is lost. And in many cases, when I lose hope, I look at Ukraine and I see, well, if Ukraine has managed it, there is hope to all of us. That means that we can do things, we can achieve things. So kudos to that.
Great. Let's end this on an upbeat note. Please join me in thanking the panel.